But Rania, you mentioned just a little bit ago the importance of independent journalism, the failures of the mainstream media. And I think one other crucial aspect of that whole conversation is what we're seeing in terms of the crackdown on journalists who are actually doing a very good job of covering what's happening in Palestine and in West Asia more broadly, and also in the social movements in solidarity with the Palestinian people around the world, especially in the United Kingdom. Significant crackdowns. Most recently, ASAW Stanley of the Electronic Intifada had his home raided by the police there on what at least seemed to me to be highly spurious charges, allegedly something terrorism, I believe, is what it is. But to get into all the different pieces of this, unbelievable attack on journalism there in the UK and on the Electronic Intifada, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Ali Abu Nima, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada. Ali, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.
I just want to ask first, maybe for those who have not seen what took place to ASAW Stanley from your outlet, the criminalization of his journalistic work, what took place there, and what do you think some of the reasons behind it and implications for it could be?
Well, what happened last Thursday, October 17th, so just a week ago at 5:40 in the morning, 10 police officers from the Metropolitan Police came to the home of ASAW Stanley in North London. They banged on the door and made him open it, and they took control of his house, and they presented him with 2 warrants, one to search his home and one to search his vehicle, and authorizing them to seize any electronic devices or documents or notes that he uses specifically for his journalism. And the pretext for this raid is suspicion or an investigation that he has made social media posts that violate the Terrorism Acts in the UK. You have the Terrorism Act 2000 and the Terrorism Act 2006, which make it an offense to, in the words of the law, invite support for terrorism. And we have to be very clear what this means. The first thing is that these laws in the UK would be completely unconstitutional in the United States. They involve purely so-called speech crimes, simply stating an opinion. For example, if you say that Palestinians have a right to resist Israel through armed struggle, that could be considered a crime under the Terrorism Act. Now, I should be clear that when the police raided ASA's home, they didn't specify which social media posts they claimed to be investigating, and they haven't arrested him or charged him with any crime, but they have seized his devices.
And Ali, this comes in sort of a pattern, right? ASA's not the first person this has happened to, though he may be the first journalist. You can correct me on that. This has happened to in the UK. But I also am wondering if you can connect this to the general attack on journalists that we've seen throughout this genocide by the Israelis. They have killed almost 100, I think it's 180 journalists at this point. They're nearing 200 journalists in Gaza alone. They've killed, I think, 3 in Lebanon at this point, though that may expand as we see their atrocities in Lebanon expand. And then just yesterday, we saw the Israeli military put out what looked like a hit list of the remaining Al Jazeera journalists operating in Gaza with their photos and accusing them of being members of Hamas, essentially telling the world we are going to murder these people. They've already murdered so many journalists. They specifically have a vendetta against Al Jazeera. So I'm curious if you could put what happened to ASA in the context of this broader attack on those trying to reveal the reality of what's taking place against those Israel's exterminating.
Yeah, what's happening to ASA and other journalists is extremely serious in the UK and in the West. And I want to come back to that because it's directly linked to this genocide. But you're right, there is no comparison with what Israel is doing, which is openly murdering journalists. And this hit list they put out yesterday is extremely worrying because unless there is a major international outcry, Israel may well go ahead and murder these journalists. And I hate to even say it. I hate to even speak the words. But we've seen enough of what Israel is willing to do to think that's the case. And I think what ties these situations together is, of course, the genocide, but it's also the silence of so-called mainstream media. There's been little to no solidarity for the journalists in Gaza, much less for journalists like ASAW. And ASAW is not the first journalist to be targeted in this way in the UK. In recent months, we've seen Kit Clarenberg, who writes for the Grey Zone and has also written for the Electronic Intifada, who was subjected to this kind of intrusive search of his devices when he was flying into the UK. The freelance journalist Richard Medhurst was arrested under the Terrorism Act and had his devices seized a few weeks ago, in August, in fact, on returning to the UK through Heathrow Airport. And we've seen other high-profile activists and writers like Mick Napier of the the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Tony Greenstein, another well-known author, writes for the Electronic Intifada, an activist in Palestine solidarity groups, arrested also for making statements that say they support the right of the Palestinians to resist. Statements that are simply, that Palestinians have a right to resist is enshrined in international law. And how can it be a crime to say that? But the British authorities are arresting people for that. And Sarah Wilkinson, another high-profile activist, who's also had her home raided by police early in the morning, her devices seized, and she was arrested. As I said, ASAW hasn't been arrested. That could happen. What ties all these people together is that they have all been in the forefront of journalism and activism against this British-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza. And ASAW is a particularly prominent journalist in this case. People who read the Electronic Intifada, watch our live stream, know his work very well. His most recent article before the arrest was about how Israel killed hundreds of its own people on October 7th, a story we've been covering for a year at the Electronic Intifada. But he brought all that information, including some new information, together in this really fantastic investigative article just days before his home was raided and his equipment was seized. And so I don't think any of that is a coincidence. One thing I will say in terms of the response, the National Union of Journalists in the UK, of which ASAW is a member, came out with a very strong statement and are supporting him. We at the Electronic Intifada are also supporting him, of course. ASAW has a very strong legal team in the UK, and they are pushing back against this very hard. And we, as the Electronic Intifada, have also engaged our own a legal counsel in the UK, and we will be doing whatever it takes to prevent British authorities from accessing these devices as a matter of principle. This is journalistic material. It involves sources. It involves information we use in our journalism, and journalists should not have to live in fear of police banging down their doors at 6 a.m. just because they're doing journalism. It's an outrage, and all of this is happening in the context of Western countries which claim to be the paragons of democracy and human rights and free speech, and they are behaving like a dictatorial thugs, and we will certainly not be intimidated by it.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the Hannibal Directive reporting that's been done, because it just feels like the impact of this in terms of, people's own consciousness is also so huge. I mean, so much of, I think, what has happened over the past 12 months, for those of us who knew about Palestine for so long, maybe some of this isn't terribly surprising, but I think for millions of people around the world to learn about these things, to be able to get, relatively unfiltered media, obviously social media is its own filter, but the importance of journalists like ASAW and others of bringing these things things to the forefront in a way that maybe you couldn't in the past, in the pre-social media era, at such a scale that, to the extent these attacks are allowed to continue and are not pushed back on, I mean, it really has a big impact of how people in the world can have the information they need to act in a way that is just.
Well, this story about the Hannibal Directive, Israel's military doctrine that allows it to kill its own people rather than allowing them to be taken captive. Most of our reporting on this, including ASA's reporting, is sourced from Israeli sources, including Israeli media. It's open knowledge there, but it's totally absent in Western media. You will barely find any reference to the Hannibal Directive. The other major story that we debunked is the October 7 rape story. There is still, to this day, no evidence of a single rape on October 7, 2023, by Palestinian fighters, let alone the mass rapes Israel claims. But what do you notice? All of these fake claims are still integral to the narratives, the official narratives of Western governments. We all saw Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, Justin Trudeau, and all the other Western leaders parroting these same lies just a few days ago after Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed. And so these lies are central to their narratives and their policies. And they can count on the BBC and the CBC and CNN and the Washington Post and the New York Times not to challenge the lies, but to further the lies and to spread the lies, which is exactly what they've been doing. So it is left to independent media like the Electronic Intifada, like Breakthrough News, like a few other outlets to bust it. And the fact is, we have busted these lies. We have exposed these lies incredibly effectively over the last year. I have to say, more effectively than I thought we would be able to, in terms of just the reach and the knowledge and the fact that people don't buy the lies anymore. And that's why they have to come after us, to try to discredit us, whether it's, we've seen in recent months, painting other independent media outlets claiming that they're Russian agents or Iranian agents, or somehow claiming that they're involved in misinformation, or now trying to tarnish the stellar reputation of a journalist like ASAW Stanley with a so-called investigation under this completely bogus Terrorism Act, which wouldn't even fly in the the United States is no paragon of free speech. We know that there is censorship in the United States, but it's done through universities, it's done through social media companies, it's done through self-censorship, it's done through people losing their jobs, but it's not done yet by the police beating down the doors of journalists at 5 a.m. And so it's up to all of us to defend the freedoms we have. And whether it's in the UK or in France or in Germany or in the United States, in all of these countries that are part of the imperial core, they are finding that the official narratives are not sticking anymore. People aren't buying them. So they're having to take the velvet glove off of the iron fist. And we all have to stand up for each other in this setting, because we don't know who's going to be next.
Yeah, that's a really important point right there, Ali. It's today it's ASA, tomorrow it's one of us, and then on and on and on. But I think there's something I want you to touch on here before we wrap, and that is specifically to the issue of the way they're using this terrorism law and the way they're going after people who are essentially supporting what you said is enshrined in international law. They're saying Palestinians do in fact have a right to armed resistance. They do, against occupation, against colonialism. And when we talk about groups that are at the forefront of that armed resistance, groups like Hamas or in Lebanon, Hezbollah, these are organizations who've been classified as terrorist organizations by a minority of the world. Just because the US says this is a terrorist organization and European countries agree and Israel agrees, that is a small segment of the world. A larger segment of the world, the vast majority of the world, actually views these organizations as representatives of segments of the Palestinian population, as a segment of the Lebanese population, and they don't treat them or classify them as terrorist organizations. So I'm just curious if you could speak to the fact that this is a classification based purely on the viewpoint of a minority of ruthless colonial countries that are trying to essentially make it fringe again, because it did used to be fringe. I don't think it is anymore. They're trying to make it fringe and make people feel like they shouldn't ever support what is literally enshrined in international law, which is that people who are dealing with invaders and occupiers absolutely have a right to violently resist that.
Yeah, and these designations of Hamas or other groups as terrorists are made by executive decree. Some government bureaucrat says this is the list of terrorist organizations, and now we can throw you in prison for life if you say the wrong thing or you do something that we interpret as supporting these groups. And these are terror tactics by the government to terrorize people into not supporting the legitimate right of an occupied people to resist or to demonize a people. We've seen how Israeli propaganda is there's no difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people. The Israeli president said right at the beginning of this, Isaac Herzog, there is no civilian population in Gaza. So we have to understand the demonization of these groups as being about demonizing the whole Palestinian people and about facilitating and justifying the genocide, which is being supported by Canada, Germany, France, Britain, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, John Fetterman, etc., by the Democratic Party, by the Republican Party too, although they're not the government right now. So that's what these things are designed to do. And I think the sea change that has happened in the last year is that people are no longer as afraid as they used to be to speak out and say, we support the right to resist. We support the Palestinian people. We see that Israel is a genocidal, barbaric entity and should be fought against, should be resisted. And so they're trying to turn back the clock by terrorizing people into silence and by escalating these use of these counter-terror laws. And by the way, in the case of the specific terrorism laws that they cited in the search of ASAW Stanley's home, back when these laws were first passed in the early 2000s, Human Rights Watch, a liberal mainstream human rights group, said these specific provisions should be repealed because they are so broad that they could be used to infringe on basic free speech rights. And that is exactly how they have been used and are being used. The Human Rights Watch predicted the situation exactly right.
Well, Ali, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here to help sort through it all. Ali Abunimah, director of the Electronic Intifada. Thank you so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.